Welcome back to the show. Today we have Ken Aldrich. He's the founder at dreamtoolbox.com. Ken, welcome back again to the show.
Thank you so much. I always enjoy it, so I'm delighted.
Yeah, I'm excited to do kind of this part two. You just released a best-selling Amazon book, and we didn't get to talk about some of the failures, which you're comfortable openly talking about, and how you've gotten through those and become successful numerous times. But maybe before we get into that, do you want to just give people a little bit of a quick background on yourself and maybe start off with where you grew up and kind of your background and maybe some career highlights along the way, and then we'll dive into the failures?
Okay, yeah, I'll do that quickly. You know my background, so if I leave stuff out that you think I should cover, let me know.
Sure.
I grew up in Oklahoma, lower class family, really, not poor, but we never had a whole lot of money. Was fortunate enough to have a mentor who talked me into applying to some East and West Coast colleges, went away to college, got a scholarship so that I could afford it, washed dishes to help pay the way, did all the stuff that you do, or that you did in those days at least. Ended up going down to New York for a year of graduate school after college, which frankly was a year of recreation in Manhattan, as it turned out. Went back to Harvard Law School and practiced law for about 4 or 5 years, and then realized that I really craved the challenge and the excitement of being on the other side of the table and being on the business side. So I started out, got into the real estate, well, initially in the investment banking business, then in the real estate business. Got sort of to my first retirement point there, but was nowhere near ready to retire. And the market changed in the mid 80s, so that you could no longer use high leverage in real estate effectively. Now you can do it again, but there was a long period when if you wanted to play in large projects, you had to go raise a fund, and that was just not something I wanted to do. So I ended up in seed stage venture capital, and that led me actually to invest in 40 or 50 companies, but also to start. I think I figured out I started 10 of them.
Wow.
Most we sold early, but 2 we took to fruition, one through a public offering and one through a highly lucrative sale to a big pharma company. So that's the background and how I ended up here.
Sure.
Then I decided I ought to write the book.
Sure. So before we get to the book, what exactly is dreamtoolbox.com and why did you decide to turn that into a book?
Well, dreamtoolbox.com started out as my effort to pay it forward, to repay, if you will, the mentors who took me when I was in junior high and high school and said, you can dream bigger dreams and you can fulfill those dreams, and helped me to do it. Otherwise, I'd have stayed home in Oklahoma. I probably would have been a success, but it wouldn't have been nearly the adventurous life I've had. So I've been very grateful. Started working with kids and realized fairly quickly 2 things. One, if I took a class of 30 kids and I spent the semester with them, 1 or 2, if I was lucky, might have a light bulb go off and it would change their lives. On the other hand, sometimes the thing that caused that light bulb to go off was just a chance comment.
Okay.
So I said, okay, it's a numbers game. How do I reach a lot of people? I started the Dream Toolbox blogs, then discovered that if I really wanted to reach a lot of people, I was going to have to write the book. So I dragged myself off into a corner and spent a lot of annoying hours writing the book, and hopefully it tells the story and will be helpful.
Sure. So in part 1 of this, we kind of cover some of the positive sides of being an entrepreneur and working your way through it. But you also are very open about talking about some of the failures and how you basically don't take it so personal, and also pick yourself back up and keep trying and keep at it. Do you want to elaborate on why that's so important?
Oh, absolutely, because it is just critically important. We are fortunate, I don't know how far this broadcast goes, but at least in the United States where we're recording it, to live in probably the most forgiving country in the world in terms of entrepreneurial mistakes. Many of the major companies that have made people multi-billionaires began with a failure. It might have been a different company or whatever. So, and there's no penalty. You don't go to debtor's prison. None of the bad things happen to you that used to happen back in 17th and 18th century England. So failure is not a death sentence in this country from a business point of view. Uh, what is very crippling is fear of failure. And that, I think, destroys more dreams before they ever get off the ground than any actual failures. And it's, I'll give you an anecdote out of my personal life that didn't have to do with a business, but I was practicing law and I wanted out.
Sure.
I wanted to go get in business. But it was very hard to get into business from law back in those days. It was some years ago. And so I finally found somebody who would hire me, and I got ready to leave. And most of my colleagues wished me well and were happy about it. A handful of them were openly jealous and really upset with me. And I couldn't understand why. And later I realized they were upset because I was taking a risk that they were afraid to take. I took a pay cut. I went into an uncertain future, and they were living in the fear of, what if I don't succeed? What if I have to come back with my tail between my legs and beg for my job back? What'll my friends say? All of that stuff. And the reality is, none of it matters. So what if you fail and you're embarrassed? You'll be embarrassed for a while. The people who really care about you are still going to be your friends, and the others probably weren't very good friends anyway. But that fear stops more people than you can imagine from taking a shot at their dreams. One of the ways to counteract that fear, and then I'll get into some specifics because I know that's what you were asking about, but one of the best ways to counteract that fear is what I call looking into the abyss, which is to sit down and say, okay, if I try this business, whatever it is, what's the absolute worst thing I can imagine that would happen? Now, if that worst thing is I'm going to die, then maybe I got to rethink that. But it isn't usually. The worst thing is the business itself goes broke and you have to start over, that you're embarrassed to your friends and neighbors, and your wife is unhappy with you. There are always things that you wouldn't like to have happen, but almost none of them are ones that I would call fatal events. And once you've looked into that abyss, then you can deal with the fear of failure pretty well. I say, okay, I've seen the worst that can happen. Now let's see what could be the best that could happen. It changes the mindset remarkably and isn't hard to do. Sometimes a little painful to think about it. But if you can't get past that moment, then you probably shouldn't be an entrepreneur anyway, or at least you shouldn't do that project. But the other thing is, stuff happens when you're trying to start a business. Things go wrong. And one of the examples that is most poignant for me was I started a company with some other people. We had a scientist who was our leader, if you will, on the scientific side. And we were going to develop what we thought was going to be the best way of measuring the human eye for LASIK surgery, which now everybody's very familiar with. And it was less well known, 15 years ago. But it was a well-established procedure, but we thought we had a better instrument. Well, we made a mistake. The problem was our instrument we had to develop it, but it potentially was better, but nobody cared because what they had was good enough. People couldn't see the difference between, I'll be technical for a moment, between 20 diopters and 15, or really couldn't tell the difference between 20/20 vision and 20/15 vision. It didn't matter. And so we couldn't raise money and we couldn't get anybody involved. So fortunately, we didn't quit. And we had another idea. We said, well, wait a minute, there's a children's disease called amblyopia, lazy eye, and it's actually genetic. I don't think it's a disease. But if it's not treated early, the child ends up with one eye that just doesn't work. And it's a very bad outcome.
Sure.
The problem is, if you don't treat it by about age 5, it becomes permanent. And how many kids can say, gosh, I can only see out of one eye? They don't communicate it. So we said, we'll use this device and we'll diagnose it. And that was a better idea. But what we found was the market was too small and we couldn't raise any money for it. Okay. Actually, I have one of my former partners is still working on that and is trying to reinvent or reestablish that. And I hope he succeeds because it is a real problem for which there's no easy cure or no easy treatment. So we had to, look at it again and say, shall we just shut this thing down? fortunately, we thought, well, let's think about it. And in the process, we talked to people, and a physician, a surgeon, was a friend of ours, says, you know, where you really could use that technology is in people doing cataract surgery.
Oh,
The
interesting.
old style was you did cataract surgery. They made their best guess as to what kind of a new lens to put in. And most people ended up still having to wear glasses and not completely happy. The device is now out. We sold it to a large company after a few years, and they are getting better results or equivalent results with cataract surgery as people are getting with LASIK surgery on healthy eyes.
Wow.
So it was a huge, huge win,
Sure.
but would never have been if we quit when we first got kicked in the teeth, which we did. So that's one example, at least.
Sure. And how many years did it take you guys to get to that cataracts version?
About 5 years.
Okay, so you were at
And
it
then
for a
it,
while.
oh yeah, we were at it for a while. We had to raise additional money. We had to convince our existing investors to stick with us. And then it was another 4 or 5 years before we got from the right business model to the ultimate sale. We started with, I think we raised privately about $5 million before we ever went to the venture capitalists. They put in more money over time, and we ultimately sold the company for over $300 million.
Wow.
So the investors did very well, but it wouldn't have happened if we just quit at the first turn in the road that seemed like a dead end.
Sure. So just to reiterate, it took you 10 years to basically sell that company, and it took you 5 years to get it to a point where people were actually using it and investing in it.
Exactly. And one of the things that I've learned is it's very, very rare for a very successful company to get there quickly, if
Sure.
you're starting from ground zero. And if you go back and look, even some of the really big companies that are successful and you read about on Wall Street still went through a fairly long period of time of struggle before they got there, if you will. Well, a good friend of mine founded a company that's now a multi-billion-dollar company on the New York Stock Exchange, but I was on his original board of directors. And 5 years into the deal, we were still worrying whether the company would make it. And
Wow.
we'd had to redefine, or he had to redefine his market several times because the original target market turned out not to be big enough and not to be really right. He finally got it right, and the company, as I say, is now a $3 billion company on the New York Stock Exchange. My investment in that company returned 150 times my money.
Wow.
So that's not normal, by the way. It happens every once in a while. But if you're an investor in venture capital, and you can get back 3 to 5 times your money over a 5 to 7 year period, you're doing very well. And that's
Sure.
enough to do quite well. That'll cover up the ones that you have to close down, and there
Sure.
will be some of those.
Sure. So I want your thoughts on and advice around, you do have, say your company fails or you need to shut it down or it's not successful. What advice do you give people to pick themselves back up and get remotivated to either try something new or start something new? Because that in itself can be really challenging.
It can. I mean, the first advice is if you had investors involved, be honest with them. And obviously, you should be honest with them all along the way.
Sure.
But go back and say, look, this is what we tried. This is what didn't work. And I have never been sued by an investor, and I've certainly had companies that failed. I don't take investors now. I do it with my own capital. But so that's a start. And if you're your own investor, whether of time or money, you've got to be honest with yourself and say, okay, this didn't work. Now, why did it not work? And are those reasons that it didn't work something that I can correct in a future deal? Um, I wish I had a magic bullet to tell you how to kind of pick yourself up and do it when you've had a failure, because it is a jolt to the ego. But the most important thing is remember that the failure of the business is not the same as you being a failure, because businesses fail all the time and their founders go on and start something new that becomes a huge success. And I've seen it over the last 20 or 30 years, time and time again. I would fund a company that went on to be successful. And when I was interrogating the founder, would find out this was his second or third try, or her
Okay.
second or third try. In fact, I know some venture capitalists who prefer to fund companies where the founder has failed in the past, because they say they're not going to come into me all arrogant and figure it's easy.
Right.
They know the agony of defeat, and that makes them sometimes better, particularly if they're coming back and they obviously are making the second effort or the third effort. They're proving that they have some resiliency. So it's just a matter of shifting that mindset again from I can't to I can.
Sure. I'm curious, this is a little maybe off topic, but I'm curious to get your thoughts around the whole mental health thing. Seems to be at least getting publicized. I don't know how much we're talking about it. I don't know how much action is actually happening, and I don't really have a solution for it. But how do you, or how have you over the years made sure you've kind of kept your sanity through the highs and lows of all the things you've been involved in?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert in mental health,
Sure.
and I don't want to imply by anything I say that genuine mental health is something that you just automatically pick yourself up from your bootstraps. I have known people, uh, uh, family of friends of mine, let's put it that way, who had children who were schizophrenic, or who, for whatever reason, got into drugs and alcohol and just couldn't get back out. So that's a different matter. And
Sure.
some of those people can be helped. Uh, there are medications that help some. But in terms of what I'll call the non-medical depression that can happen in careers, um, an awful lot of it is probably, in my mind at least, very similar to that situation that I described in terms of how do you deal with fear of failure.
Okay.
Say, okay, here I am. I've just failed. Things have gone down. But is this really, is this the rock bottom? Is it the worst it can get? If so, I've got nowhere to go but up.
Sure.
If you're fortunate and your wife or significant other is still with you and supportive, or friends or whatever, you say, look, I still have friends. I still have a network. Hopefully you still have your health. Whatever it is, look at the blessing side and say, what do I have? What can I make from it? And that's not easy to do when you've been kicked in the teeth and, things look pretty darn bleak. And I've been there. But you have to do it. Otherwise, life spirals down, and you'll be looking back and, from your rocking chair in the nursing home when you're old and saying, gee, I wish I had tried one more time,
Sure.
or whatever the regret is. And it's tragic when I see that happening.
No, fair enough. I'm curious though to talk about how do you, when you get an idea for something or you're dreaming of something that you want to try to accomplish, how do you actually get the motivation to just start and go for it? Because I think some people really struggle with that.
Well, in my case, I think, again, it goes back. The first step I have to do is go through to one version or another of the dream forming exercises that I outline in the book and say, is this really a dream that I care about? Because if the dream is just, I'd like to be richer than Steve Jobs, that's probably not, for most people, enough motivation. I mean, I'm sure there are some people to whom just getting really rich maybe is enough motivation. I don't envy them because there's no reward in it. Everything I've ever done that has been successful and rewarded me has been something I really wanted to do for some other reason. I wanted to get involved in medical sciences because I didn't know necessarily what I was going to do, but I knew that if I was successful, lives would change. So part of it is wanting to do it. Is there a real reason you want to do this thing? And I think that's maybe as much as anything the real key. Beyond that, I think it's a matter of looking at it and saying, is there any reason on earth that I shouldn't give this a try? Any reason to think I actually can't do it? Because the answer probably is, I don't know. But wow, if I could pull this off, I don't know that he ever had it, but suppose Steve Jobs said, wow, if I could create a device that people could hold in their hands and play music and talk to friends and plan a trip to the moon on, wouldn't that be cool? I have no idea whether you ever had those thoughts, but
Sure.
the point is the same. And that one of the companies I founded, the dream was, wouldn't it be incredible if we could find a cure for diabetes? Now, we
Sure.
didn't, but we also found some other things that were very valuable, one of which was what I think will ultimately be a treatment for a disease called retinitis pigmentosa, which causes blindness and is
Oh, wow.
at this point incurable. So you don't always get to the objective that motivated you, but that motivation is important.
Sure. So how do you stay motivated in, year 2 or 3 of something where it's still not really hitting the mark and maybe you're not generating revenue yet?
Well, I think that's a matter of doing what the exercise that I think I described either in this episode or the previous time you interviewed me, I'm not sure,
Sure.
which is to imagine myself where I want to be in the long run as if it had already happened.
Okay.
And I call it active dreaming. Other people call it visualization, et cetera. It has a lot of names and it's a well-known technique. But if you're really thinking about what it will feel like when you get there, what will it feel like if I have cured diabetes? What would it feel like if I've built a great company? Whatever the dream is, that makes it a lot easier to slog through the valley of death between the original idea and actual fulfillment. And it is a slog sometimes. I mean, you sometimes just have to think about where am I going and what's the shining city on the hill that I'm headed for. And there's no easy answer, but it's definitely doable. And I've gone through that valley many times.
Sure. No, that's interesting. So obviously now it seems like one of your biggest motivations is to give back and share the kind of good, bad, and other advice to up and coming generations. What else do you maybe want to demystify a little bit as we kind of close out the show here?
Well, I think interestingly, that objective is one of the more frustrating ones for me because everything else I could have an objective and say, I'm going to achieve this and I'll get to see the results. I will never know what lives I've changed. I hope there will be many, but I'll never know. So I just have to find a way to keep the dream alive in my head that what I'm doing, I know works if people use the tools. So I just have to hope that I reach enough people and enough of them decide to use the tools. And I'll never know, but that's okay, because I'm confident that I will have changed some lives and made them better. And I can live with that.
No, that's interesting because it's interesting that you say that because I've obviously taken some online courses in the past that you learn a new skill that you use every day and you maybe use it for years. But you're right. The people that I actually took the course from will never know that they taught me something that I've used for the last decade, right? Like as day to day, which is interesting.
Can I give you a suggestion? Sure. Send them a note.
Okay.
It's amazing how many people don't do it. But once in a while, I'll get a note from somebody or a phone call. Say, you made a difference, and that'll make my whole day. And it doesn't happen very often. And if you're the recipient of the advice, it takes very little time, and you'll make somebody's day.
Sure. But Ken, we're kind of coming to the end of the show. So let's close again with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself, Dream Toolbox, and the book.
Yeah, all of that's most readily available and single source is just to go to www.dreamtoolbox.com. Dream Toolbox is all one word, of course. And that'll give you links to the book. If you want to buy the book, there's a subsection in there with my bio in it. It'll give you links to our Twitter and Instagram accounts and all the social media stuff that fortunately I have a good friend who manages for me because it's not my strength, but we're there. And I think that's the easiest way. And I hope people will read it. By the way, just as an aside, any net proceeds from the sale of the book are all going back into charity to help children's education. So
very cool.
I'm not promoting it to get rich. I'm promoting it in the hope that I can change some lives.
Very cool. Well, Ken, as always, I really appreciate you again being on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day, man.
Thank you. Same to you.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.